Buonasera a tutti, stiamo aspettando che tutte le persone possano collegarsi, quindi vi prego di avere un po' di pazienza perché diamo tempo a tutti di entrare nel nostro webinar. Quindi qualche minuto di attesa e poi partiamo con il webinar. Prego di aspettare. Io intanto saluto tutti coloro che sono già collegati e vi chiedo un po' di pazienza perché abbiamo appena aperto la diretta e stiamo aspettando che le persone possano collegarsi, quindi diamo tempo a quanti sono in attesa di entrare. Quindi un attimo di pazienza e poi partiamo con il pomeriggio, con il webinar di oggi pomeriggio. Intanto, come sapete, abbiamo un nostro ospite, il professor Cattaneo, Arturo Cattaneo, che sarà con noi oggi questo pomeriggio per il webinar di oggi pomeriggio, organizzato in collaborazione con Mondadori Education e con l'Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore di Milano. Ovviamente con la consueta collaborazione con la Mediateca Montanari e con il sistema bibliotecario del Comune di Fano e il Comune di Fano. È un'attesa, un po' di pazienza e vedo che si stanno collegando, che i nostri ospiti si stanno collegando e man mano che si collegano aspettiamo ancora qualche minuto e poi partiamo con il nostro webinar. Allora, man mano vedo che si stanno collegando sempre più persone, quindi tra poco cominciamo. Intanto do il benvenuto a tutti, i nostri ospiti di questo terzo webinar. Allora, vedo che continuano ad entrare le persone, continuano a collegarsi. Chiedo a tutti ancora un poco di pazienza per permettere a tutti di seguire dall'inizio e di non perdere l'inizio del nostro webinar. Aspettiamo ancora qualche minuto e poi partiamo. Un po' di pazienza. Siete tutti collegati con il Think Outside the Box di oggi pomeriggio, terzo webinar, terzo incontro con il professor Cattaneo dell'Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore di Milano. Allora, tra poco ci siamo quasi, ancora chiedo un poco di pazienza perché vedo che continuano a salire il numero di partecipanti. Siamo tanti, d'altronde devo dirlo, perché le registrazioni sono state veramente tantissime e quindi chiedo a tutti di pazientare ancora un attimo. Prima di cominciare il nostro incontro. Allora, sono appena le 3:35, quindi aspettiamo ancora un paio di minuti e partiamo per questo terzo incontro, terzo webinar, Think Outside the Box, Series 2022-2023, organizzato dal Liceo Nolfi Apolloni di Fano in collaborazione con la Mediateca Montanari e questa sera in collaborazione con Mondadori Education e con l'Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore di Milano. Quindi tra poco avremo l'onore di parlare e di ascoltare il professor Cattaneo. Intanto vi do qualche informazione tecnica, visto che siamo in attesa per permettere a tutti, alle persone di collegarsi. Come sapete, è possibile, avrete tutti un certificato di partecipazione, coloro che sono registrati, docenti registrati sulla piattaforma del MIUR Sofia potranno scaricarlo direttamente dalla piattaforma. Una volta concluso il webinar, una volta conclusa la fase di verifica di tutte le presenze. Per coloro che non si sono registrati su Sofia, comunque riceveranno l'attestato via email, non sarà la prossima settimana, ma sempre dopo la verifica di tutte le presenze ai 3 webinars della series di quest'anno. Ma riceverete l'attestato all'indirizzo email col quale vi siete registrati. Una cosa però che prego tutti di fare: quando cominceremo il webinar sarà passato nella chat un link per registrare la propria presenza oggi, quindi è importante cliccare sul link e riempire la Google Form per registrare la propria presenza, per attestare insomma che avete frequentato oggi pomeriggio e quindi contare la vostra presenza ai fini dell'attestato di partecipazione. Quindi mi raccomando, verrà passato più volte durante il corso di tutto il webinar, mi raccomando insomma di riempire la Google Form. Allora, vedo che io direi che possiamo anche cominciare. Diamo l'avvio al terzo webinar. Buonasera a tutti e ora passerò all'inglese. Welcome to everybody. I'm Valentina Foschi and I'm very happy to welcome you to the third webinar of Think Outside the Box series 2022-2023, which is EFL teacher development, professional development course developed organized in collaboration with Mediateca Montanari of Fano Municipality, and this afternoon together with Mondadori Education and Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore in Milan. First of all, I want to thank all the collaborators, so to speak. So first of all, Mediateca Montanari and Fano Municipality, and thanks to them, we can have the webinar online because we're using the YouTube channel and the Zoom platform of Fano Municipality and the library system of Fano. So thank you again. Now, I won't move on now, but I will stop to leave the stage to Professor Samuele Giombi, who is the headmaster of Liceo Norfia Polloni, who is with us this afternoon to welcome you, to bring his own welcome. And I'm very happy, and I want to thank him because I know that it is another busy day for him, and I really appreciate the fact that he's with us. So I'll leave it to him. Grazie, Professor Giombi, grazie per essere con noi.
Sì, davvero grazie a voi, sono io che ringrazio voi, ringrazio in particolare la professoressa Foschi che ha organizzato questa serie ancora quest'anno con grande competenza e generosità, così come ringrazio, diciamo così, partner istituzionali di questa nostra impresa, e cioè la Mediateca Montanari di Fano con l'assessorato alle biblioteche, poi Mondadori Education, in altre circostanze, in altre conferenze abbiamo anche avuto Macmillan Education, e l'Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore che questa sera diciamo partecipa a questa nostra iniziativa, e in particolare poi il relatore che da quell'università proviene, il professor Cattaneo, che abbiamo già avuto il piacere di ascoltare lo scorso anno con grande diciamo davvero attenzione e beneficio per tutti noi. Quindi lo ringrazio ancora davvero di cuore per aver accettato anche quest'anno di offrirci questo suo contributo. Tra l'altro è molto bello e significativo che concludiamo questo ciclo diciamo tornando in una dimensione di storia letteraria, di letteratura e di cultura cinematografica, per così dire. Abbiamo iniziato con gli incontri precedenti proiettandoci su una dimensione diversa, quella più legata ai social, alla gamification, a certo tipo di approcci diciamo innovativi legati al vissuto giovanile contemporaneo. Oggi concludiamo tornando sulla dimensione diciamo della cultura letteraria cinematografica, e questo mi pare un ottimo traguardo, diciamo un ottimo punto di arrivo, per così dire. Ecco. E davvero dunque ancora grazie. Io non credo di poter rimanere sino alla conclusione, adesso ascolterò fino a quando mi sarà possibile, e quindi in anticipo, anziché farlo in conclusione, rinnovo il ringraziamento a tutti i partner, alla professoressa Foschi, e questa sera davvero ancora mi preme dirlo senza retorica, al professor Cattaneo. Grazie ancora.
Grazie Preside, grazie Professor Giombi. And I would like to move on to say a few things about this afternoon. Okay, this afternoon we are having this webinar with Professor Arturo Cattaneo, full professor of English literature at Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore in Milan. And he's going to talk about Shakespeare versus Hitler, Harry V, and war propaganda in Laurence Olivier's and Kenneth Branagh's films. So the films, the first one was produced in 1944, and the second one in 1989. So I think it's going to be very, very interesting, and I'm curious about what the professor is going to tell us. I'm sure we don't need to introduce Professor Cattaneo, but just a few words about him. I think it's important to tell you about his latest research, which have been about, in particular, Shakespeare and Hollywood and the cinema. And he's about to publish a new work, and I'm really waiting for it, okay, which is going to deal with exactly these kind of topics. Actually, Professor Cattaneo told me that this part of this webinar of the webinar of this afternoon is going to deal with basically it's one chapter of his book. So I'm curious also about all the other chapters. I'm curious there will be lots of questions about it because I was talking to him before we started the webinar, and it is I'm sure that all of you and all of us, at least the teachers who teach Shakespeare at upper secondary school, we use movies and filmic sequences to make our lessons even more memorable. We were talking about the importance of images and imagery for the students nowadays who tend to remember more and longer and better when they see something, and not only when they read something. And so I think it's going to be very, very interesting for us all and very useful for our teaching as well. Now, I told you that, as you know, he's full professor of English literature at the Catholic University of Milan, but he is also a writer. He has written so many interesting not only literature books for upper secondary schools, but novels, essays, researches, and both in Italian and in English. And I'm sure many of you have already read many of them, or at least some of them. His research interest, he did postgraduate research at the Warburg Institute in London, which is one of the most important institutions which link literature and history of arts. And his research interests include not only the influence and transformations of the classics in the English Renaissance, which was, I think, his original his point of his original first research, but then also the 18th century English novel, and also Anglo-Italian cultural relations and Caribbean literature. So a wide range of topics, all of them very challenging and stimulating. He published several books, such as Shakespeare and Love, Shakespeare and Amore, with Einaudi, and also the two novels Ci vedremo a settembre and La notte inglese in 2012, this last one. But I won't say anything else, because I really want to leave the stage to Professor Cattaneo, and I really want to thank him, because as Professor Giombi was saying, it is the second time that we have got the honor of having him with us, and I'm very happy, and I hope it's going to be second time of a long series of webinars and seminars, hopefully in presence again here in Fano with all of you, or with many of you, hopefully. Thank you, Professor Cattaneo, and we are here to listen to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Foschi, for this very kind and generous introduction. It's really my pleasure and my honor to be here again. And I want to thank you, your Liceo Nolfi, the library, and the municipality of Fano for this chance again. So I hope some of the people who are connected were there last year, and there might be new people. So hello to everyone, in fact, to begin with. I'm just sorry that I got a bit of a flu and my voice isn't at its top, but I hope you can hear me, because I find it a bit difficult to speak. Well, today we're going to talk about apparently quite a strange subject. I'm going to share my screen, and I do hope it works. Yes, but I have to go back a bit. Actually, I'm trying to. Oh, here it is. Okay. Okay. Here we are. Now, this is the title, Shakespeare versus Hitler and the Fifth and War Propaganda, in two very famous films. The first one and the oldest one is this one, Laurence Olivier's Henry V in Technicolor. And I think the posters, the two posters, just giving us an idea of how different, how widely different the two films are. This is very chivalric, isn't it? Technicolor. It reads almost, shows almost like a cartoon. Whereas Kenneth Branagh's Henry V is much more realistic, and we see corpses of soldiers. We see the king spattered with blood. Something which tells the great difference between the two films, something, of course, which we're going to see in some detail. In fact, we're going to talk about the use or abuse of Shakespeare as political propaganda in wartime, and not just by Britain, which may be not so surprising, but also by Germany. More generally, in fact, we're going to see, however briefly, how Shakespeare has been used throughout the centuries in the most varied political and social debates. Obviously, we take Henry V as a case study. And I want to start with the question, in fact, does the title Shakespeare versus Hitler sound a bit of a provocation? It might, I acknowledge that, but only partly so. In fact, from the middle of the 18th century up to the end of World War II, for nearly 2 centuries, Shakespeare was the object of a cultural and political tug of war between Germany and Britain. And this is one of the things which I discovered while working on this subject, Shakespeare in Hollywood, the one Professor Foschi was mentioning. And it's been really a surprise for me and for the director friend who worked with me, because it was really thinking outside the box. So I think this is the right place to introduce a small part of my research there, which I haven't presented yet. So I'm very glad you gave me this opportunity. Why thinking outside the box in this case? Because it might be a surprise, but in 1942, there came out a film called To Be or Not to Be. And this is one of the posters, not the only one. It's quite a provocation, isn't it? We see the usual skull, Hamlet. The very title points to Hamlet quite clearly. And in the film, which is comedy, by the way, it's not a serious film, or it is serious by being a comedy at the same time, by the master of Hollywood comedy, Ernest Lubitsch, the one who directed Greta Garbo and all the great actors and actresses of the time. And it takes place in Warsaw, right in September 1939, when the Nazis invade Poland. And To Be or Not to Be becomes the password of the Polish resistance. So it's funny, but it's also linked to tragic events at that time. So much so that at that time, it's very funny. If you want to show it in class, it's sure to raise a few laughs, quite a few. It's very funny. It's a masterpiece of comic. But of course, when it came out in America, it was subject to some harsh criticism because people said, how can you laugh about Warsaw being bombed by the Nazis? That was obviously in the middle of World War II in 1942. So that was understandable. And the film is so strong in a way, despite its comic side, that in Germany, for instance, it came out after the war. It came out in all over the world, everywhere. In Italy, the title was Vogliamo Vivere, which of course loses, the Shakespeare part, To Be or Not to Be. In Germany, which was, of course, the country more concerned, and badly so, with the story, the film only came out in 1962, 70 years after the end of World War II. And the title was aptly Sein oder nicht sein, but look at what surrounds it. Heil Hamlet, Heil Hamlet. Again, this is a bit of a provocation, but it shows something which is historically true. Since the middle of the 18th century, in Germany, Shakespeare was the object of a real idolatry. It was the Germans romantics, the Sturm und Drangs, poets and critics and philosophers, who created the myth of Shakespeare. Herder thought of him as divine. And Goethe, a young Goethe, on something that he wrote in 1777, I'm trying to, right, 1770, wrote this great praise. The first page of his I read, put me in his debt for a lifetime. And once I had read an entire play, I stood there like a blind man, given the gift of sight by some miraculous healing touch. And I'm trying to get to the next slide, but right, okay. And what Herder and Goethe thought of Shakespeare was by no means unique. In Germany, in the 18th and 19th century, the cult of Shakespeare rose to such great heights as to become, as I said, idolatry or bardolatry before the term was coined by G.B. Shaw at the end of the 19th century. And it so happens, and that's been another surprise for me while I was researching this, that the first scholarly Shakespeare society in the world was not founded in Britain nor in America, but in Germany. And it was the idea and the work of an industrialist from Dessau who had made a fortune with gas, of all things, Wilhelm Ockenhauser, but who had a passion for Shakespeare, like most Germans at that time. And in 1864, and the year is quite clearly significant, it's an anniversary, he founded the Deutsche Shakespeare-Gesellschaft, where? In Weimar. Why Weimar? This is explained in a book which I quote because it might be of some use for those of us interested in these things, by Andrew Dixon, an English writer, a very good book, by the way, Words Elsewhere, Journeys Around Shakespeare's Globe. And here Dixon says, placing a Shakespeare society in the spiritual capital of German culture might not only be convenient, Ockenhauser realized, it could also be a symbolic act. Bach, Branagh, Luther, Goethe, Schiller, why not Shakespeare? The man was practically a native. Now, of course, Dixon is writing in these days, so one might think that he might be a bit skeptical about this or ironic about this. But in fact, in the 19th century, the myth of Shakespeare rose to unexpected heights. This is, for instance, what a successor of Goethe and Schiller as director of the Weimar Court Theatre, Franz von Dingelstedt, wrote, "Behold today, as the third in the sacred trio, the Briton joins Germany's Dioscuri, Goethe and Schiller. He too is ours." But what about the philosopher and writer Hermann Ulrichi, who said something even stronger? We want to de-Anglicize the English Shakespeare. We want to Germanize him, to make him what he already is, a German poet. Now, of course, these were the years of the German political unification, which came in 1871. And the trend increased in the course of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century. So it is no surprise really that when the Nazis came to power, one of the very first things they did was to get hold of the Shakespeare Society. And well, in their own way, predictably, they chased all the throughout, in fact, all the members who were Jews or of Jewish background, and they used the society for their political uses. We're talking about big names like Goebbels. We're talking about Hitler, who in his diaries often quoted Julius Caesar and took sentences from Shakespeare into use in his own speeches. This, for instance, is what Hans F.K. Gunther, author of a famous or notorious A Racial Typology of the Jewish People, wrote, giving a lecture on Shakespeare's Day in 1936. And the lecture was on Shakespeare's girls and women from a biological perspective, where the English poet is presented as a fervent eugenicist whose works upheld the ideal of racial purity. Now, of course, how much of this is true is quite open, but it's quite significant that this is the extent to which Germans used Shakespeare, and the Nazis took advantage of that. The thing had begun in World War I, not the thing in itself, obviously, because we've seen it goes back much further back, to the middle of the 18th century, but in political and war terms, warlike terms, to World War I. This is what Alois Brandl, president of the Deutsche Shakespeare-Gesellschaft, addressed his colleagues in Weimar, claiming that Shakespeare belongs to our spiritual armament. And please note the word armament. This is just before World War I. And he ended the speech quoting the words of Henry V before the Battle of Agincourt. "O God of battle, steel my soldiers' hearts." So we're getting close to Henry V, which is the real core of our talk today. And it is no surprise that the British reacted to that. So 2 years later, in 1916, the British playwright Henry Arthur Jones wrote a pamphlet called Shakespeare and Germany, in which he says quite strongly, "We may ask by what insolence and egotism, what madness of pride, Germany dares act to the hideous role that thieveries and rapes, the topping impudence and crime of vaunting to herself the allegiance of Shakespeare." Now, with these, not to give the idea that the use or manipulation, if you want, of Shakespeare was only a German feat or enterprise or trend, cultural trend, we want to say that the Americans did that too. Since the beginning, the United States began a tug of war with Britain for the property of Shakespeare. They claimed that Shakespeare was more theirs than British. One of the battle cries during the Revolution was to be taxed or not to be taxed, which of course goes to the core of the Revolution, taxation T, by repeating, quoting or misquoting Shakespeare. And again, during my researches, I came across this, which was really surprising, the war between different styles of acting, British actors and American actors playing Shakespeare. And there was a famous incident that took place at the Astor Place Opera House riot in New York. Unfortunately, this says 1949. It is not 1949. Clearly, it is 1849. In 1849, at the Astor Place Opera House in New York, there was a riot in which between 17 and 31 people died, and between 30 and 150 were wounded. Why this oscillation in number? Because it's not sure. The one thing which is sure is that many people died and many people were badly wounded. And what for? Because of a style of recitation, style of performing. But as Jack Lynch, in another beautiful book, which might be of some interest, Becoming Shakespeare, wrote, Jack Lynch is American, by the way, he aptly rightly points out that the Astor Place riot was about much more than a performance style. It was really about American identity. The two actors, the British William Charles Macready and the American Edwin Forrest, presented two visions of Shakespeare, one British and aristocratic, the other American and proletarian. American nationalists were determined to reclaim the great cultural icon as one of their own. He may have been English, but for these working class Americans, he was above all a democratic playwright, not a supporter of aristocracy. And I really must apologize for the many mistakes in this slide. Spelling mistakes. But I hope, the point has come home quite clearly. Not just the Germans, but the Americans too, and many other countries and cultures in the world have appropriated Shakespeare in the past few centuries. So, as Shakespeare became the great English genius, people increasingly used him to advance their own agendas. A choice quotation could lend Shakespeare's authority to a policy, political party, an educational program, even a war. In revolutionary ages, Shakespeare became a revolutionary. In conservative ages, Shakespeare became a conservative. Whatever was needed to preserve his position as a national poet, especially for England and America. And if he didn't say quite the right thing, his words could always be rewritten to suit the purpose. And so it is no surprise that when the war comes, when World War II comes, Laurence Olivier, who was the great star, the main actor, but also the director of Henry V in 1944, said, I had a mission, my country was the war. I felt Shakespeare within me as an Englishman. I felt the cinema within him, which might be more surprising. Let's bear in mind that only 5 years later, Laurence Olivier would act and direct in Hamlet, the one and only film so far from Shakespeare to have been awarded an Oscar, an Academy Award for Best Picture, and a turning point really in the history of Shakespeare at the cinema. Now, this Henry V is something special in itself, because of course many war films had already been made, and many more would be made. The film, but in 1943, at Britain's darkest hour, the Ministry of Information, in charge of show business propaganda, wanted something bigger, something higher. With the Normandy landing not too far ahead in time, Shakespeare Henry V seemed the perfect play, the perfect story to suit the spirit of the nation in times of war. And so they asked Laurence Olivier to make a film of that. Now, two questions might arise quite spontaneously. First one is, or better, one reflection and one question. The reflection is, okay, Laurence Olivier, he was the right choice, or the obligatory choice. He was a great Shakespearean actor, one of the three great Shakespearean actors, together with Ralph Richardson and John Gielgud. He was handsome, a dashing personality, and he was also a Hollywood star by that time. So he knew what great films, mainstream films were about. He knew them firsthand. But why Henry V and not Hamlet, for instance, or King Lear? Well, the answer is quite clear. Henry V was the patriotic work of Shakespeare par excellence. It's the only history play which tells not of problems of succession, not of problems of internal wars, like, for instance, Richard III, which is much more popular in Italy. But Richard III is about a king who's a villain, a Machiavellian, whereas Henry V is the only history play by Shakespeare in which the English go to war on the continent and defeat a continental enemy, in that case, the French. So that was the patriotic work of Shakespeare. It had been used for centuries as a totem, a war totem, by the English and by the Americans too. Now, this is King Henry V, and we must say that even in Shakespeare's time, he was already not only a revered figure, but also the epitome of chivalry. He was the warrior king. He was a great knight, and it's been so up to today, we might say. This is how the 600th anniversary of the Battle of Agincourt was commemorated at Westminster Abbey on 29th October 2015. And in Shakespeare's time, this is something which is little known, but it's quite surprising and quite telling. People, even poor people in Shakespeare's time, would go to Westminster Abbey and pay a penny to go and see the helmet and the armor of the warrior king, of the chivalry king, Henry V. So 1 penny, which is exactly the same amount of money they paid to be groundlings, to be standing spectators in Shakespeare's theatre. For the same sum of money, the lowest sum of money at that time, one could go and see Henry V on stage. But one could also go and see Henry V at Westminster Abbey, the relics there. So that's one reason why the play and the king were so popular, very popular. And Laurence Olivier had made before making the film, had already made many apparitions as a patriotic speech maker with exhortations to war taken from Henry V, declaimed in what is being called a Churchillian vein, like Churchill. And of course, especially the famous St. Crispin's Day speech, because that's the second great thing. So sorry. That's the second great thing about Henry V as war propaganda. Not only is it a great story of the English winning a war on the continent, which the English or the British were hoping to do at that time in World War II, obviously. But it also contained the most famous war speech in all English literature, the St. Crispin's Day speech, where we find the very famous, very often quoted sentence, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers," because that's another thing which had a clear resonance for the British at that time. Apparently, what the Battle of Agincourt had in special was that the English were outnumbered by the French. There were many Frenchmen to few Englishmen. And to boost the morale of his troops, the king, instead of complaining about how few they were, he makes that something to be proud about. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. The fewer, the better, because we're going to win anyway. And of course, at Britain's darkest hour, that sounded really like a boost for the morale of the nation. So let's have a quick look at the St. Crispin's Day speech. Not all of it, of course. It's great, even in class it works very well, even today. So the King Henry V starts with the question, what's he that wishes so? What's he who would want more people here, more soldiers from England? And King says, no, if we are marked to die, destined to die, we are enough to do our country loss. And if to live, the fewer men, the greater share of honor. And he goes on to say, yes, I want honor. If it be a sin to covet honor, I am the most offending soul alive. Honor, of course, here is the honor of dying for one's country, dulce decorum est pro patria mori. So he tells his cousin, wish not a man from England, or do not wish one more. Why? That he which hath no stomach to this fight, let him depart. His passport shall be made. Wonderful sentence, his passport shall be made. We could use it today. Incredible. And then comes a famous reference to the day. This day is called the Feast of Crispian. He shall live this day and see old age will yearly on the vigil feast his neighbors and say, tomorrow is St. Crispian. Then will he strip his sleeve and show his scars and say, these wounds I had on Crispian's day. And it goes on, beautiful lines, but we have to skip a few. The conclusion, the very famous conclusion. Crispian shall never go by the day St. Crispian, from this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered, we few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that shed his blood with me shall be my brother, being never severe, this day shall gentle his condition. And gentlemen in England, our best, shall think themselves accursed, they were not here, and hold their manners cheap whilst any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's day. Now, of course, on the mouth of a great actor, this was bound to, well, to inflame audiences and to give courage such a trying time. And it's been noted, and rightly so, that Winston Churchill's speeches often contain references, whether plain references or disguised references, to the St. Crispin's Day speech. This is, for instance, is a World War II poster containing the famous lines by Winston Churchill in his 1940 radio speech during the Battle of Britain, so darkest hour really, inspired by the St. Crispin's Day speech and showing members of Bomber Command, especially in this sentence, never was so much owed by so many to so few, very Shakespearean, and to so few a clear reference to the speech. Of course, Churchill wasn't the first one to use the St. Crispin Day and wouldn't be the last one. Before him, to give just one example, during the Napoleonic Wars, prior to the Battle of the Nile, Horace Nelson, Rear Admiral of the British fleet, referred to his captains as his band of brothers. And on the day of the result of the 2016 European Union membership referendum, the Brexit, as the vote to leave became clear that Brexit would win, activist and MEP Daniel Hanna is reported to have delivered an edited version of the speech, replacing the name Bedford, Exeter, Warwick, and Talbot in Shakespeare plays with other prominent vote leave activists. So we see how easily Shakespeare can be adapted to any situation. Battle of the Nile against Napoleon, Horace Nelson, World War II, the Brexit referendum. And of course, it's no surprise that in 2001, there came out an American war drama miniseries produced by Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg called Band of Brothers. The title of which is clearly inspired by the St. Crispin's Day. and the quote is given at the end of the last episode. Okay. Going back to Henry V, 1948, Laurence Olivier's film, the film is dedicated to the commanders and airborne troops of Great Britain, the spirit of whose ancestors has been humbly attempted to recapture. But some of us, or many of us, or most of us, all of us, I don't know, might have silently asked themselves, okay, Henry V is a great play about the British defeating the French on the continent in France. But in World War II, the French were not the enemy, they were the allied. So how could Olivier, how could the British adjust to that? Well, they did, what they had done for centuries. They simply changed the play, slightly changed it, but in significant places. Olivier eliminated everything that might tarnish Henry's or the English image. The treacherous English heirs are left out, so no traitors. There is no mention of Bardolph's execution, so the king that now sent to death one of his men, and above all, the French city of Harfleur surrenders without Henry threatening to leave its naked infants pitted upon spikes and to rape the city's fresh fair virgins, which is exactly what Shakespeare says, what Henry V says in the play. Also, there is no order from Henry that every soldier killed his prisoners. And the film changes the play in such a clever way that, in fact, the film celebrates more than the victory over France, which is there, of course, you cannot change it altogether, but the annexation of France to England and the link between the two nations with the marriage between King Henry and Princess Catherine of France. So it's a marriage that links the two together. But above all the bad things about the English are left out. And it is also significant, very, that Laurence Olivier omitted the ending lines from the play, because Shakespeare plays end with a look at the future, saying that Henry VI, so the follower of Henry V, in infant bands crowned king of France and England, did this king succeed. The states so many had the managing because the new king was an infant, hadn't come of age yet, that they lost France and made his England bleed. In other words, the conquest of France, the victory of Azincourt, didn't have a suit, didn't bring great things for Britain, or for England at that time. No one in 1984 wanted to be reminded that war might be pointless. War had to finish, and there would be a great future after that. So people wanted to think. Especially after World War I, the war that was supposed to end all wars, apparently, 80 years later, it is perhaps best to remember, for the staggering loss of human life, dozens and dozens of million people, young people from all over Europe, a real carnage. And the great powers, in fact, battled it out to see who would be left standing at the end. It was like a cruel boxing match, which is, of course, once more polished up by propaganda. This is a famous poster, women of Britain saying to their men, marching men, go to war. But some writers, some poets like Siegfried Sassoon denied that. This is a famous sonnet by Siegfried Sassoon, who had been at war, had been a war hero, by the way, Glory of Women, in which he really decries the heroism that has been put forward by war propaganda. The reality was this, in a painting, terrible painting by John Singer Sargent, Gast, and the real reality was this. Astonishing, isn't it? So this is what war was. And people began to think that World War I had not been the war to end all wars, quite the contrary. And it took a woman, Virginia Woolf, to write at the eve of Second World War, the year before, in fact, 1938, in 3 guineas, to renounce the patriotic approach. She said, she wrote, "As a woman, I have no country. As a woman, I want no country. As a woman, my country is the whole world." Something really worth thinking about even today. Now, we jump a few years, a few decades, and it may not come as a surprise that after the further horror, after Virginia Woolf wrote that, after the further horrors of World War II, after so many wars fought all over the world in the second half of the 20th century, after the dissolution of the colonial empires, a new film version of Henry V by Kenneth Branagh in 1889, 40 odd years after Olivier's film, should show the play under a different light, less triumphant and adulterated. Branagh's film was ready to reflect the anti-Falklands War sentiment, which was strong in Britain in the 80s. And this shows once more in this poster, in which we see the warrior king surrounded by soldiers, ready to kill quite clearly. On the background, we see the fire of destruction of the city having been taken. And this is the reality of war that Kenneth Branagh wanted to show. A blood-spattered king and his soldiers crowded together, lying in mud and blood. Something totally unheroic, nothing at all like the Technicolor poster of Laurence Olivier's 1944 film that we've seen at the beginning. And it's been said quite rightly that Branagh's bold moving concentration, been pointed out by rightly, Branagh's bold moving concentration on the human cost of war rather than heroism. The gritty realism was designed to reflect British ambivalence to military expeditions 7 years after the controversial Falklands conflict. And though Olivier's film was made in wartime, it is Branagh who more clearly reveals how Shakespeare's play laid down a template for countless war movies about 20th century conflict. A cinema critic, John Sutherland, pointed out that my lie, not El Alamein, was what came to mind watching the 1989 film. And my lie is the massacre and mass murder of unarmed South Vietnamese civilians by the United States troops in 1968 during the Vietnam War. If we want to know something about Branagh's intention, ideas in making this film, we might read his notes, the notes he published in preparation for the film. Branagh restores scenes eliminated by Olivier, notably the threat before Harfleur, described by Branagh. Remember the threat before Harfleur: if you do not surrender, we're going to kill all your infants or your children. We're going to put them on spikes, which is even stronger than kill them. And we're going to rape and kill all your virgins or your daughters, your wives, which unfortunately is what happens in all wars. Branagh restored that because according to him, there was a speech which underlines the cruel aspects of an increasingly desperate English military campaign. As usual, with Shakespeare, we come to see that, haven't we? In quite a few instances so far. Shakespeare and the play could be seen in different ways, contrasting views. For instance, the right-wing Daily Express complained about the weakly king who weeps openly on the battlefield in front of his demoralized troops, whereas the left-wing Guardian praised the humanity of the young king, a man also capable of magnanimity, inspired leadership, and the saving grace of youthful self-doubt. And again, it's almost inevitable that every war has brought about different readings of Henry V. This is, for instance, the review by the Observer of Nicholas Hitner's modern dress production of Henry V at the National Theatre in 2003. And the date is significant because it's just a few months after the US and British invasion of Iraq. And we know that the British intervention was much criticized and made the subject of an inquiry, of a British inquiry, because it was thought that that Britain had been taken to war on false information. And that's exactly what the Observer review points at when they say, if there is any topical resonance in Shakespeare's play, it comes from the story of a national leader, notice not a king, so the reference to Tony Blair, to former Prime Minister Tony Blair is quite clear, going to war on highly dubious grounds, and who, in the play's best scene on the night before the battle, is put on the spot by one of his common soldiers. And these are Shakespeare words. The soldier says, "The king hath a heavy reckoning to make if his cause be not good. The cause for war had better be good, because we're going to die. Many of us are going to die." Sorry, something went wrong. I'm sorry about this. I've lost control of.
Professor, is visualizzazione. You should go to visualizzazione di lettura.
Yeah, the
In the
point
upper part on the left. Visualizzazione di lettura.
Yeah, but the point is that I cannot see visualizzazione because, oh yeah, here we are.
On the left.
Visualizzazione, scrittura.
Di lettura. Oh. In any case, it would be at the beginning. This is at the very beginning. But it should be visualizzazione di lettura. I can't read it, the upper part of your screen.
Okay. Can you see it now? Because I can see it.
We can see the first slide. Only the first slide with the think outside the box postcard. Okay, if you move on, yes, if you keep on moving, we are on women on
Yep.
of Britain, say go.
Yeah, but the point is that they do not move. Oh, yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so sorry about this, really. My mistake. So we are going back to Kenneth Branagh's film. We're talking about the Falklands War, 1982, which was Britain's last war, even though the war officially was not declared. But even so, it was quite clear that the country went to war. And it was so clear that it was the subject of many, interventions in parliament, obviously, of great debates all over the country, whether to go to war against the Argentinians, against Argentina or not. And it's quite significant. I wish to quote an editorial which came out in the Times at the height of the political crisis between Great Britain and Argentina over the Falkland Islands. Now, the Times is clearly in favor of armed British intervention. What is interesting in the passage we're going to see is not just the general tone in which this is expressed, which is, of course, very telling, highly patriotic, at a time when patriotic ideas seem to be a thing of the past, but also what the editorial says. Now, in the first slide, we're going to see the rhetorical frame of the whole thing. And I use rhetoric here, rhetorical, in a technical sense. It's very well done, whether we like it or not, whether we agree with that or not, because it proceeds by short sentences. There must be no doubt about our strategic objective. As the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, by the way, said in the Commons on Saturday, the Falkland Islands are British territory inhabited by British citizens. They have been invaded by enemy forces. And of course, this is matter of fact, undeniable. These forces must be removed. This might be more open to debate. The authority of Britain must be reasserted over the islands. But what comes next is really the most rhetorical part. The Falklanders are our people. They are British citizens. The Falkland Islands are British territory. When British territory is invaded, it is not just an invasion of our land, but of our whole spirit. We are all Falklanders now. The references, continuous references noted 3 times Falklanders, Falkland, 3 times British, 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 territory, invasion, rhetorically, this is all very well constructed. As I said, whether we agree or not. And of course, many Englishmen at that time, many British did not agree with that. But I really want to see with you the conclusion, because it has to do, again, with literature, not with Shakespeare this time, but with a contemporary of Shakespeare, John Donne. And the conclusion is, conclusion in the Times editorial, we are an island race, and the focus of attack is one of our island, inhabited by our islanders. At this point of decision, the words of John Donne could not be more appropriate for every Briton, for every islander, for every man and woman anywhere, in a world menaced by the forces of tyranny. And the article ends with the quote by John Donne, from John Donne: "No man is an island entire of itself. Any man's death diminishes me, because I'm involved in mankind, and therefore never sent to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee, it tolls for us, it tolls for them." And now, quite clearly, the reference also was to Ernest Hemingway's famous novel, For Whom the Bell Tolls, 1940, which is about the civil war in Spain, another war which was thought to be a just war, whatever that means. But it's quite interesting to see how, in times of war, writers can useful. Of course, Shakespeare is the main instance of that, but in this case, John Donne. And in this case, I'm sure that some of us might have wondered, well, but John Donne is with the sermon, or meditation as it's called, from which this is taken, John Donne's meditation or sermon is really about universal peace. It's not at all about the word. He says no man is an island, not to say that islanders are always right, but to say that we are all part of a continent because we are all humans. So if that meditation and that sermon by John Donne is something, is about universal peace, universal acceptance. And here it's been taken to mean something different. Very well done. We grant that. What's the morale of the story? Again, Jack Lynch becoming Shakespeare. And I quote him because I think he put it very well. Shakespeare is of use whenever we want to, or people want to uphold something. When Britain was debating abolition of slavery in the 1830s, both sides were keen to claim Shakespeare's authority. By the 19th century, it was difficult to find any high-profile public debate in which Shakespeare's name was not invoked by both sides. Should Roman Catholics have the right to vote? Should Jews become naturalized citizens? Should Ireland be granted independence? What's the proper function of education for women? Partisans on all sides of every issue were ready with their illustration for Shakespeare. Now, we might like this or not, depending on how we see that, how we wish to see that. For my part, the one good thing about this anyway is that Shakespeare is still used. And it might be interesting also to tell our students about the ways, some of the ways in which Shakespeare has been used. Some of these, of course, are not convincible. We may not agree with them, but that Shakespeare is the all-important writer for the modern world is being amply proved by the use or abuse is being put to throughout the past 2 or 3 centuries. Well, thank you for your attention. I apologize once more for my voice and for the little inconvenience with the slides. I'm finished, and of course, if there are any questions, I'd be more than glad to answer them to the best of my knowledge. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Cattaneo. Thank you very much. Very, very interesting. Let me tell everybody, if you want to ask questions, please write them in the chat and we will ask your questions to Professor Cattaneo. So please write them in the chat on YouTube, and we will ask those questions to Professor Cattaneo.
So do I have to click on chat?
Yes. Oh. If you just stop sharing maybe the slides, interrupt the sharing.
Okay.
Yes, so that we can see each other.
Okay.
And waiting for the questions to arrive. And thank you. Let's see if someone is going to start with a question. I think there are many references you touched upon, which are very, very interesting, and lots of bells which rang in my mind. And while waiting for someone's questions, I would start with asking you something. One is when you said at the beginning, you spoke about the history plays written by Shakespeare, and you mentioned Richard III. Yeah. And you said that basically Henry V is a very patriotic history play, in the sense that Henry V is a patriotic character. Yeah. And so I really thought of Richard III as the opposite, and I thought of many other, let's say, kings in Shakespearean plays, not only the history plays, but also tragedies. So I was thinking of Richard III on that side as a very Machiavellian kind of prince and king, a very bad character, really terrible, and the good one that is Henry V as a patriotic king. And then I thought of King Duncan in Macbeth, again, the good king, even though maybe a less interesting character compared to Henry V, in my opinion. So it's just a good character, a good king, and that's it. And then, of course, someone in between Henry V and Richard III, who is really Macbeth, someone who starts as a good one and then slowly becomes very bad and terrible in his actions and behaviors, and all his deeds remain, as live as pot, not only on his hands but on his souls. So I wanted to ask you for your reflections on these, just as examples, but when you spoke about when you mentioned Richard III and you spoke about Henry V, I was thinking of those ones, and I don't know if you can elaborate a bit on these.
Yeah, well, of course. No, actually, I mentioned Richard III because if we talk about history plays, Henry V is not the first one that comes to mind for an Italian reader or student. And I mentioned Richard III as the one who is probably most in our minds, also because of its villain king, who's a great character, who has great speeches, who begins with such a great sentence, now is the winter by discontent, or glorious summer by the son of York. That's it. And of course, Henry V is the only history play which is not centered on internal affairs. All the others are mostly centered on history, English history, that internal. This is the one, that shows the English at war outside England. And of course, that's what they needed at that time. But, to expand a bit on what you said, which is very interesting, Shakespeare writes a lot about kings. And one might say, well, that's obvious, they still had, quite a classical idea of tragedy, according to which tragedy was about kings and queens and high station people. So why not kings? It's inevitable. But on the other hand, he wrote, I think, 11 history plays, if not 12. That's something which is not, which I began to realize while working on these things, actually. Two things. History plays, nearly one third of Shakespeare's plays, there's some 36 or 7 or 8, but nearly one third are about history plays, which is quite a lot, isn't it? Of course, that tells that this subject was very popular in his time, because otherwise he wouldn't have written them. He was a man of the theater. He wanted to make money out of plays. He wasn't just an artist for art's sake. So that's one thing. And the other thing that surprised me when I began to reflect on the first folio, for instance, is that when his colleagues, his fellow actors, Hemmings and Conde, published the first folio, they made it very clear on the front page, on the title page, the division: tragedies, comedies, history. And to my knowledge, that's the first time it was ever done. And of course, history plays can be seen, or I see them, but I think many people too, as action plays dealing with politics, which is what has become immensely popular today. And I believe that's one of the reasons why Shakespeare is still so popular, so much our contemporary, as the phrase goes. Of course, we could expand quite a lot. If you want, we might come back to that. What you said about King Lear, about Macbeth, all his tragedy. The one thing I would say is that while not being revolutionary, and he could not be a revolutionary in his own time, while writing about kings, Shakespeare is never is never a flatterer of kingship. He shows kings in their greatness, but also in their baseness, and that I think is very important. That's why he's still read, and that's why it was popular in his own day. Well, it's a very long question, and it would need a very long answer, but to begin with.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you. Very, very, very inspiring. Also, what you mentioned, his ability, I think, to show the good sides, but also the bad sides of person who, besides being a king, he's a person and has got periods in his life which might be easier, and some periods which might be more difficult. Which is also shown in Henry V. You know, this is change from what he was. You know, he liked to drink a lot with Falstaff in his youth before becoming king, and his becoming wiser later.
Actually,
yes.
Well, that's a very good remark. You know, what you said is very important because, in fact, you know, Henry V. You know, I didn't say it, you know, for reasons of space, but it's very important that you pointed it out. Before the court, we have a play like Henry IV, and in Henry IV, you know, we see a young future king who doesn't really behave like a young future king, like a future king at all. You know, he spends his time drinking and whoring with Falstaff. And the other thing which is surprising is that, but it's also very true to nature, is that the moment that young profligate becomes king, he renounces Falstaff. He casts him away. There's a terrible sentence in the play when Falstaff goes up to the new king, and he would obviously like to renew their friendship or to remind him of the good times they had together. And the king simply says, "Old man, I know thee not," which is the most dismissive, a terrible sentence. Imagine us, any of us, telling this to somebody we grew up with. "Old man, I know thee not." That tells a lot about the way Shakespeare deals with kings too.
Yes, thank you. Then I wanted to ask you something else, but I will do it later because I've seen that there are a few questions from some teachers. So one of the questions, and I'm going to read them, one is from Professor Sabertinato. Isn't also the Bible used in a similar way? No, I don't know exactly what she refers to.
Yeah, well, I think she might refer to the fact that the Bible too has been read in different ways. Yeah, absolutely. You know, well, that's not my field really. It's always I'm always wary to talk about the Bible, except as a reader, obviously, because it's such a delicate and important text. But if what she means is that the Bible too has been used to uphold, you know, the most different policies and ideas, absolutely so. You know, the Bible has been taken, I believe, you know, to justify nearly everything in history. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But of course, you know, to do that, you need texts which have universal value, like the Bible and Shakespeare. You can do it occasionally with very good writers like John Donne, but just occasionally. You don't do it all the time.
Yes, thank you. Okay, just this is something technical. I mean, yes, we will share the PowerPoint presentation if we can. Professor Cattaneo, can we give the slides to our participants?
Yeah, I think so. Why not? You know, as you said, you know, these slides, you know, are part of the work I've done for my forthcoming book, Shakespeare in Hollywood. And I wish to point out, you know, what I told you. something which I'm proud of, is that these things and the book really come out from my work with the students. You know, I've been teaching Shakespeare together with the director friend for 20 years, and the students have taught us many things. Their points of view have been quite interesting. And so all of that work has gone into the book and part of this. So that's been very rewarding really, working with the students about that. Well, if I may add something, you know, which might be, which has been left out, in fact, because of reasons of time. It is not just the Germans or the Americans or other cultures and countries which have used or misused Shakespeare, but also, well, the British themselves with Henry V, but constantly, you know, in the course of the past few centuries, Shakespeare's plays, especially history plays, have been adapted to the current political situation, and especially to war. For instance, a play like King John, in which the papal nuncio or nunciate has a place, has been changed quite a lot, in the sense that when Britain was at war with France, the stress was on the French as great enemies. When not, the stress was on the Pope and the Catholics as great enemies. So it's, you know, these ups and downs has been quite normal. But even the British, you know, have done that to a great extent. Whenever it was needed, you know, Shakespeare was changed. And when I say change, I mean even the text could be amended, cut, and things could be added to the text, which is surprising for us today, obviously.
So it was used, or it has been used for your own purpose, basically, for your own goal, which is what many people do.
Yeah.
I was thinking of another thing. I don't know if you spoke about several interesting authors, and you made reference to many of them and to their words. And when you mentioned the editorial from the Times, we are all Falklanders now, and the Falklands were. And I was thinking, I don't know, again, a bell ringing in my head. I'm thinking of some famous speeches, like, you know, and I don't know if there is any link we can make, or it's too far from it. From, for instance, one of the speeches by Kennedy, the one in Germany, Ich bin ein Berliner. So this same idea, we feel the same. I don't know if you can.
Yeah, you're right. In fact, you know, this appropriation is quite typical of politics and propaganda. Absolutely, yeah, that's a good thing, really. In fact, this saying, using us, or I'm one of yours, yeah. In fact, you know, the Germans used to say unser Shakespeare, our Shakespeare, both, you know, when Goethe was there and when the Nazis were there. So we see how the same thing can be quite different, you know, depending on who says it and on historical circumstances.
Yes. There's a question from Priscilla Panato. Is your essay going to be published soon? I think she's talking about the book Shakespeare in Hollywood.
Well, thank you. I take that for a good wish. Yeah, well, it's going to be published. That's one thing which is sure. As for soon, I still don't know, because well, my agent is deciding, you know, really which publishing house might be better for the book. It's going to be out soon. Anyway, I let you know, Professor Foschi know.
Absolutely, I will inform everybody. We're all waiting. I'm sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Any other question? Let me see if there is. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. There is Princess Marata who is sending a very nice message, thanking you, Professor, for this
Thank you so much,
interesting.
really. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Cattaneo. If there is no other question, let me see if there is anyone else who wants to ask questions. Okay, before if there are no more questions, I would move on to our conclusion, and I would like to thank Professor Cattaneo for this afternoon, for having been with us once again, and
thank you very much.
We will see him again next year, and I want also to thank Mondadori Education for this webinar, and Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore, with whom I have collaborated to create this event, and also Marco Camilletti, who I can see now online with us, who is the local agent for Mondadori Education in the Marche region, and also for Macmillan Education. And we've been working all these years together for the webinars we've organized. So thank you Marco, grazie Marco Camilletti. E per tutti, se avete anche domande sui volumi, i testi pubblicati da Mondadori Education ed anche da Macmillan Education, potete fare riferimento a Marco Camilletti, che è l'agente locale, rappresentante locale per la Regione Marche, e sui siti di Mondadori Education e di Macmillan Education troverete anche, siccome sono tantissime le persone, i docenti collegati da tutta Italia, potete trovare i riferimenti degli agenti locali sui loro websites. Grazie a tutti ancora. Ringrazio ancora una volta la Mediateca Montanari e il Comune di Fano per il supporto nell'organizzazione, il supporto tecnico, perché in presenza utilizziamo la sala ipogea della Mediateca Montanari, a distanza, quindi periodo post-Covid, ci siamo trasferiti online sul canale YouTube del sistema bibliotecario del Comune di Fano. Quindi grazie ancora a loro, grazie a tutti, e un grazie ancora speciale al professor Cattaneo.
Grazie a voi.
Grazie ancora, buona serata, grazie Marco, buona serata a tutti. Grazie a tutti i partecipanti e ci vediamo l'anno prossimo. Riceverete sempre l'invito da parte della scuola, potete trovare anche... Allora, una cosa voglio dire, vi sarà inviato l'attestato di partecipazione una volta verificate tutte le presenze ai 3 webinars di quest'anno. Lo riceverete via email o sulla piattaforma Sofia per coloro che si sono registrati sulla piattaforma Sofia. Il prossimo anno riceverete l'invito ancora una volta. Può darsi che inizieremo un pochino prima, quindi può darsi che riusciamo a iniziare prima di Natale il prossimo anno, e spero di rivedervi tutti ancora insieme per Think Outside the Box Series 2023-2024. Arrivederci a tutti, grazie ancora a tutti.